Tonight, you'll hear the confession of a dagger, a blade that never wanted to kill. If I could speak, I'd ask you something simple. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be held only when someone plans to kill? Not feared, not admired, just used. I was never meant to feel, but I saw, I remembered, I bled with every hand that gripped me. And now, after centuries of silence, I will tell you what it truly meant to be the dagger of a medieval assassin. This is not a tale of glory. This is the story of a blade that begged to be put down. I was born not in a cradle, but on an anvil, beneath sparks that danced like fireflies and sang a language made of clang and smoke. My edges were not kissed by a mother's hand, but by the calloused grip of a blacksmith who hummed old war songs as he worked. They say objects do not remember. They say we are only tools. But if I could speak, I would tell you that I remember everything. I remember the first time his fingers wrapped around me. He was not yet a killer, just a boy with tired eyes, a patchy beard, and a stitched wound on his brow. The kind of wound that doesn't bleed much, but never really heals. He paid for me with silence. A silver ring dropped onto the anvil without a word. The blacksmith didn't ask questions. Some people wear grief like cloaks. He wore his like a shadow. He didn't give me a name, but in the dark, when no one watched, he would whisper to me. Not with words, but with breaths, shallow, anxious, rehearsed. And when he slid me into his cloak, he did it with a care so gentle it made the leather hum. He walked with the stillness of someone who had made a decision long ago. Not out of rage, not out of justice, but because he thought there was no other way. We traveled through forests that slept beneath snow, villages that didn't show up on maps. He didn't speak to people, just listened and waited. Each night he would lay his head on a sack of grain, wrap himself in his cloak, and place me beside his heart. I felt it. Even through the fabric and leather, I could feel that uneven rhythm. He had nightmares of a fire, of a scream, of a little girl reaching out, only to vanish into smoke. Sometimes he would wake with a gasp and draw me halfway from my sheath as if needing to see me, to remind himself I was still real. I was. I always was.
Then came the whispers in the inns.
the Lord who burned the village, the knight who left no survivors, the man in the silver mask. That was our destination. He wasn't hunting revenge. He was following absence, the kind left behind when someone takes everything from you, even your reason to live. I learned his name from a stranger, not from him. They called him Elias the Quiet, and they said he had once been a healer. A healer! Can you imagine? The same hands that now trembled when they touched me, once stitched wounds, once held herbs, once whispered, "You'll be all right." But something broke, and whatever rose from the pieces no longer prayed. We reached the castle by winter's end. Its towers pierced the clouds, its guards laughed by fires. Inside those stone walls was the man in the silver mask. That night, Elias held me differently. There was a slowness to his touch, a reverence. He oiled my blade, not with the cold detachment of routine, but with something close to apology. "Just once," he whispered. His voice cracked like frost on old wood. "After this, I can sleep." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. I had rested against his chest long enough to hear all the words he never said. And so we walked into the lion's mouth. The castle halls echoed like empty bones. No resistance, not yet. Elias moved like a memory, silent, deliberate, fragile. He knew the turns, the steps, the shortcuts. And then, at last, the chamber. The silver mask was there, but not on a man. On a table, beside a goblet of wine and a silk cloth stained with something darker. The room smelled of incense and fear. From the shadows came the voice. "I wondered when you'd come." Elias didn't answer. He stepped forward. I felt the moment. His heartbeat slowed. His breath flattened. Then he drew me. The sound was soft, a kiss of metal on leather, the beginning of an end. That's where I'll pause, because what came next is not for the faint-hearted. And if I could speak, I would say this: not every weapon wants to be used. Some of us carry blood not with pride, but with the sorrow of knowing we could have been something else. I could have been a letter opener, a ceremonial piece, a gift. But I was the dagger hidden in his cloak. And this was only the beginning. If I could speak, I'd tell you what silence sounds like when it walks into a room with intent. It sounds like the slow exhale of a man who's run out of choices, like the soft creak of boots over cold marble, like the hush that falls right before everything breaks. That night, inside the chamber, I felt Elias change. His grip didn't shake. His breath was steady. But inside, somewhere, I could sense but never see, he wasn't the boy who bought me in silence anymore. He was something sharper, colder, resolved. The man who stepped out of the shadows was older than I expected. His face wore time like armor, thin lips, graying beard, a scar that stretched from his ear to his throat like a forgotten map. He wasn't afraid, not even surprised, just annoyed. "You waited long," he said, circling the table. The silver mask lay between them, catching the dim firelight. "You could have come sooner, when your anger still burned hot, when your grief still had fangs." Elias didn't speak. He only held me tighter. The man smiled. "But you're here now, so tell me, what will it change?" I wanted Elias to speak, to curse him, to say her name, to make it matter, but he remained silent. And sometimes silence cuts deeper than any blade. The old man, the one they called Lord Varick of the Mask, didn't draw a sword, didn't move toward a bell, didn't scream for guards. He only walked to a chair and sat. "I remember you," he said. "You were there, the healer, trying to stop the bleeding of a world already lost." His fingers drummed on the armrest. "Your village was not chosen by accident, you know. It stood in the way. And in war, we move through what stands in the way." He looked Elias in the eye. "Even children." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind clawed at the stone windows. Inside, something else howled, but only within Elias's ribs. His breath hitched. I felt his fingers twitch just once, and then he spoke. "Say her name." A whisper. Broken. Desperate. Lord Varick raised a brow. "Who?" Elias stepped forward. "Say her name." Still, Varick didn't flinch. "You'll have to remind me. There were so many." That was the moment. Not when Elias lunged. Not when I left my sheath. Not when I sang through the air and found skin. No. The moment was before. The moment a man decides. There's no going back. The lunge was clean. The strike practiced. I pierced cloth, then flesh, then something deeper, something warm and final. Varric didn't scream. He gasped, a sound like disbelief, like surprise that the end could be so quiet. He stumbled back, hand to his chest where I now rested. His eyes met Elias's. "Does it bring her back?" he rasped. Elias said nothing, just pulled me out, slowly, like removing a thorn that had festered for years. The blood came fast, and with it, the shaking. Not Varric's, Elias's. His body trembled as he stepped back, and he dropped to one knee, like a knight kneeling at a grave he dug himself. He looked at me, for the first time, like I was a stranger. There were no shouts, no alarms, no thunder of boots rushing in. Varric had lived in paranoia, but died in peace. No guards in his chamber, no protection, only mirrors and regrets. Elias wiped me on the silk cloth, stained darker now, then placed me back inside his cloak. His breath came hard, but his eyes, they were empty, not of sorrow, but of purpose. We didn't flee. He walked calmly through the halls, like a man returning from a long, boring meeting. No one stopped him. No one knew. At the castle gate, a guard yawned and nodded. Elias nodded back. And just like that, we were outside. The stars blinked above, silent witnesses to a murder long overdue. We camped not far from the walls. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat and stared at nothing. Finally, he spoke, not to me, not to the fire, just aloud. I thought it would feel like justice, but it just feels like less. I understood, because when revenge burns out, it leaves behind something colder than grief. Emptiness. That night, he buried the ring, the same silver ring he had traded for me. He dug into the frozen earth with bare hands, placed the ring inside, and whispered a name I had never heard before. Amara. The girl in the dreams, the scream in the fire, the reason for everything. He didn't cry, but sometimes silence is a kind of weeping too. At dawn, we moved again, not toward home. He didn't have one. Not toward peace. That was never his to claim. We walked simply because there was no reason to stay, and I remained beneath his cloak, no longer hidden, but no longer needed either. And still, I waited, because men like Elias, once they cross a line, they don't stop walking. They just look for the next shadow. And I, the dagger in his cloak, would follow. I remember the meadow. It was supposed to be beautiful. He said so. He called it God's backyard, like that made it any less of a grave. The grass was high, soft, and warm in the sunlight, and the yellow flowers swayed like dancers in a far-away kingdom where no one had ever heard of blood. But we brought blood with us. We always did. He pulled me from my sheath like someone untangling a memory, carefully, reverently, like I mattered. But I was never the purpose, only the tool. We were waiting for a man, a name, a heartbeat. And when he came on his horse, dressed in linens finer than anything my owner ever wore, I could feel the pulse in the boy's wrist tighten. That pulse always came just before the act, like thunder warning the fields. The man didn't scream. He didn't even seem surprised. He just looked at my boy, then at me, and closed his eyes before the blade kissed his ribs. Do you know how quiet it is in a meadow? The wind holds its breath. Birds fly off in pairs, and the blood soaks down like it's trying to feed the earth, as if it believes something will grow from it. Afterward, my boy sat with me on his knees, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Not to the man, not even to me, but to himself, as if part of him had died too, or maybe just the part that still believed in meadows. We left quickly. The job was clean. No witnesses, but he still limped like guilt had weight. That night, by the fire, he didn't sleep. Neither did I. He held me in his lap, wiping me clean, though I was already spotless. One day, he whispered, "I'll use you for good." But we both knew he wouldn't. The town we passed through next was silent with fear. Word of the man's death had spread like rot in an apple barrel. Everyone knew. No one spoke. Eyes followed him, not in admiration, not in awe, but the way you look at a lightning-struck tree. Survived, but not right. I met another blade that day. He wore a red jewel in his hilt. His master was a nobleman, smug and wide-chested, who liked to show him off like a trophy. The blade and I touched briefly at the waist of our owners, like two ghosts brushing shoulders in a hallway. He spoke in metal tongue. He said, "You smell of regret." I didn't reply. What could I say? That I used to dream of being a kitchen knife? That I thought I'd be cutting bread, not fate? There was a child that night, a girl, 7, maybe 8. She saw us in the alley. My boy slumped against the wall, hand on his stomach, bleeding from a job gone wrong. She ran to him, not away. She tore a bit of cloth and pressed it to his wound, trembling. "Why do you hurt people?" she asked. He couldn't answer. He just cried. And I lay beside him in the dirt, ashamed to shine in moonlight. A week passed in silence. No jobs, no names, no blood. My boy began to draw with charcoal again, like he used to before he was a killer. Faces, animals, hands that weren't holding knives. I hoped maybe he was done. Maybe the meadow had ended it. But then came the letter, wrapped in black ribbon, sealed with wax that smelled like cloves and rot. A name, a price, a promise. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. I could feel it in the way he gripped me again, like I was part of him, like I had never left. That night, under the full moon, I watched him walk toward the city's heart. The guards didn't see him. No one did. But I knew that once again I'd be kissed by lungs, that I'd drink the warmth that once sang lullabies to children, and that afterward he would not pray, not for them, not for himself, but maybe, just maybe, he would remember the meadow, and that would hurt more than anything. Would you still sleep, knowing I was beneath your pillow? Would you dream, knowing I once stole someone else's? Sleep gently, listener, for I am far away now, but my memory lingers, not in blood, not in steel, but in the sigh of a meadow, long after the wind has moved on. It was midnight when we arrived at the monastery, a place built from stone and silence. The walls were high and damp, and the doors didn't creak when they opened. Nothing creaked. Nothing dared. Even the wind was polite here, slipping gently between the arches like a monk afraid to pray too loudly. He carried me beneath his cloak, close to his ribs. I could feel his heart, slower than usual, not calm, numb. He hadn't spoken since the letter. No humming, no apologies, just breathing and footsteps and the sound of decisions already made. The target was a priest, not a criminal, not a traitor, a priest. His crime? Knowing something. I never knew what, but my boy did, and it haunted him. He knelt in the shadows outside the chapel, fingers twitching near my hilt. I could almost hear his thoughts. They weren't planning, they were pleading. He wanted the priest to run, to disappear, to vanish like so many had before. But the priest didn't run. He walked calmly into the chapel, lit a candle, and began to hum. The tune was old, older than my steel. It spoke of rivers and mothers and forgiveness. And as it floated through the air, I could feel my boy breaking. He stood, walked, not fast, not slow. Each step was a question, each breath a sentence left unfinished. He opened the chapel door. The priest turned and smiled. "Your burden is heavy, child," he said. And that's when I knew this one would not fight, would not scream, would not beg. He had already accepted death as if it were a guest long expected. My boy did not draw me, not right away. He sat beside him. They spoke. I don't know what was said, but it wasn't war. It wasn't death. It was the kind of talking that softens a man's bones, the kind that feels like spring after too many winters. But then the bells rang, not church bells, the kind tied to armor, guards, sent by someone who didn't trust the job to be done. My boy looked at the priest. The priest nodded, and that was all. I was drawn, not like a sword of war, but like a pen before a signature, a soft cut, a prayer. The priest died with a smile and a whisper, "You are not your blade." And just like that, I hated myself again. We ran through gardens, over walls, across fields still wet from last week's rain. I could feel his breath in my handle, heavy, hurried, like a man trying to outrun his own heartbeat. We found shelter in a stable, empty, safe, almost. He collapsed into the hay. I lay beside him, stained but silent. He didn't cry, not this time. He just whispered, "That one knew." The days that followed blurred like a watercolor left in the rain. We moved from town to town, no names, no questions, just the road and the silence, and the same letter in his pouch, unburned, unread again. He stopped drawing. He stopped smiling. He stopped sleeping. And then he stopped running. There was a hill overlooking the city, a place where flowers grew from rocks and birds sang like they'd never heard of steel. He sat there for hours, sometimes with me across his knees, sometimes with a dagger pressed to his own throat, but never quite enough pressure. He was afraid, not of dying, but of becoming me forever. One morning, we woke to voices, a caravan, traders. Among them, a woman, Not beautiful in the way stories like to describe women. Beautiful in the way forests are. Unbothered, still. Old in her soul. She spoke gently. She gave him bread. She didn't ask what he had done. And maybe that's why he stayed. Weeks passed. He worked with the caravan, carried crates, tended fires, told no one his name. The woman began calling him Ash, a name that felt like an apology. He kept me wrapped in cloth, deep in his pack, unseen, unspoken, but not forgotten, never forgotten. Then came the market, crowded, loud, alive in a way we hadn't felt in years. He was smiling, actually smiling. The woman laughed at one of his clumsy jokes, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like someone who didn't know what blood tasted like. But fate is cruel. It always finds you, even in crowds, especially in crowds. A man recognized him, an old client, drunk, loud, called him Ghost Blade. The name spread like fire on parchment. Ash turned pale. The woman's eyes narrowed. And suddenly, I was in his hand again, unwrapped, cold, ready. But he didn't strike. He dropped me in the middle of the square, let me fall, heavy, sharp, and silent. People turned, gasps rose, but he didn't care. He walked away. I was picked up by a boy, a street kid, wide-eyed. He held me like treasure, but I was nothing to him, just a weapon. And weapons, we always find new hands. But that's a story for another time. Sleep now, listener, for the world is full of cloaks and secrets and blades that once hoped to be something more. And though I am far from that monastery, far from that smile, I still remember the candlelight and the man who forgave me, even when I could not forgive myself. If I could speak, I would tell you that silence is never truly silent. You may think that being hidden beneath old wooden floorboards is a kind of rest, a break from violence, a lull in a life otherwise steeped in blood. But I, an assassin's dagger, know better. That silence is a lie. It hums with secrets. It hums with fear. I remember the day he hid me. It was not our usual escape. There was no rooftop running, no slipping through alleyways in the dead of night, no rinsing blood off in cold rivers. That night he didn't flee. He just returned to the stone cottage and opened the trapdoor in the floor. He didn't even clean me. I still had the stain of a lordling's death along my edge. That metallic smear dried quietly as he tucked me in like an old relic being buried. He didn't whisper. He didn't say anything to me like he sometimes did. Just a sigh. just a pause, and then the weight of the floor returned above me. And so began the wait. You see, time moves differently for a blade. I didn't sleep. I didn't dream. I only listened. The creaking of his boots, the faint coughing in the cold mornings, the scrape of bread against a knife, never me, never again. Then voices, strange voices, and then no voices, just dust, just the quiet shuffling of rats and the slow breathing of a man who no longer needed me. He had changed. I once drank the blood of kings and traitors. I slid through silk and bone. But now I was no longer his hand's extension. I was memory, a ghost. He had hung up the cloak, burnt the gloves, grown a beard that smelled of smoke and soil. He even tended to a garden. He smiled at children. But I remained, hidden, patient, listening. Then came a night, the kind where the wind howls like wolves mourning the moon. I heard him open the trap door. The hinges groaned like they were waking from a long sleep. His fingers touched my hilt, cold, hesitant, reverent. He didn't draw me out. He just held me there, as if weighing a question. "I'm not that man anymore," he whispered. But he didn't sound sure, and still he closed the trap door once again. Weeks passed. Then came fire. It started quietly, crackles, hisses, the sound of glass breaking under heat. The cottage was under attack, not from knights or bounty hunters, just a common fire, careless and cruel. I felt the heat above. The floorboards shrieked and sagged. Ash trickled through the cracks. He didn't come back for me. He ran, I think. I hope. I'll never know. The cottage caved in slowly. Timbers collapsed with deep groans, like dying men. I waded beneath it all, smothered by stone, swallowed by scorched earth. Years passed. I know because the sound of seasons returned. Rain above, roots pushing slowly down through the wreckage, mice nesting beside my hilt. Once a fox sniffed at the ashes and left. The world moved on. Empires may have risen and fallen above me, but I stayed, buried, remembering. And then, one day, a hand reached down. Not his hand. It was smoother, younger, a boy's hand, calloused from shoveling. He found me wrapped in soot and silence. He pulled me free, coughing on the dust. I blinked, metaphorically, against the light of a new world. His eyes were wide, curious, afraid. He didn't know what I was. Not yet. But I knew what I had been. And I wondered, would I be again? If I could speak, I would have told him to leave me there. Not out of bitterness, no. I've long since surrendered to the stillness of being forgotten. But because that boy, with the trembling hands and dirt-smudged cheeks, didn't know what I was, what I had done, what I might do again. He was maybe 12, too young to recognize the shape of violence that lay hidden in beautiful things, too innocent to see that I was never just a knife. He turned me over in his hands, brushing off the soot and ash. My blade caught a sliver of sunlight and glinted just enough to make his eyes widen with wonder. He ran his fingers along my spine. Thankfully, he didn't touch the edge. I was still sharp, and I hated that. The boy carried me home. His home wasn't like the assassin's. No hidden corners, no trapdoors, just a modest hut beside the edge of a village, built from timber and kindness. His mother scolded him for bringing home junk from the fire ruins, but she let me keep me. I was placed on a shelf above his bed, resting between a cracked jug and a carved wooden ox. I lay there, quietly, for months. At night, I watched him sleep, his small chest rising and falling. No blood on his hands, no nightmares in his dreams. He was still untouched by the world I knew. And I hoped, truly hoped, that he would never find a reason to use me. But the world has a way of finding sharp things. One morning, there was shouting, not the casual shouting of market sellers or quarrels over sheep. It was the kind that breaks the sky. Angry, desperate shouting. Then the thunder of hooves. Raiders. They came from the hills, rough men with rusted swords and wild laughter. They burned barns, overturned carts, stole whatever was shiny or edible or both. The village had no guards, no walls, only frightened people and prayers. The boy hid under the floor with his mother. I heard his breath shake. I heard her hand gripping his shoulder. But someone saw them. The floor creaked. A boot stomped above. A voice sneered. Then came the scream. I was still on the shelf, alone, unused, watching. The boy burst out of the trap door, screaming, flailing, wild. He didn't know what to do. He just knew he had to do something. His hand reached up and found me. It all happened so fast. A man twice his size, a swing of an arm, a grunt, and then me. I felt flesh again. I felt the warm shock of blood as I slid through a raider's side. The man stumbled backward, eyes wide, surprise turning into rage, and then into silence. The boy stood frozen, his small hands shaking, still holding me. It was the first time I had been wielded by someone with tears in their eyes. Not anger, not duty, just fear. He dropped me after that. The village buried the dead. They called the boy brave, a protector, a hero. They were wrong. He didn't feel brave. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his room, staring at me. I was back on the shelf, but now I was a stranger, a secret, a weight. He didn't touch me for weeks. But the world had changed. Whispers came of other villages burned, of danger crawling from the mountains, of men needing to learn how to fight. The boy began training, not with me, not yet. He learned how to hold a wooden sword, how to block, how to swing. His hands grew calluses, his back straightened, his eyes hardened. I saw it coming. He was becoming the kind of person who would need me. The day he reached for me again, it wasn't with wonder, it was with certainty. There was no hesitation. He strapped me to his side with a new leather belt, worn like armor. He walked through the village, taller somehow, older. They still called him boy, but he was no longer a child. He didn't use me often, just enough to scare off a thief, to gut a wolf, to defend his mother. Each time I felt it, each time I remembered, and I wondered, does it always happen this way? Does every hero start with one desperate act? Does every child who picks up a blade end up walking the same path? I wanted to believe he would be different, but blades don't get to choose who they become in the hands of. And boys don't get to stay boys forever. If I could speak, I would have asked him, "Why are you starting to look like the man I once belonged to?" It began slowly. At first, it was just a shadow in his gaze, a quiet calculation before he spoke, a hesitation in his laughter. But over time, the softness in him began to retreat, like the tide slipping away from the shore. He still lived in the village, still hugged his mother, still helped mend fences and carry water, but he wasn't really there anymore. His eyes were always somewhere else, watching the hills, listening for danger, anticipating pain before it arrived. He wore me more often, not like a weapon, like a limb. It was no longer about needing me in an emergency. It was about always being ready. Even when he smiled, he wore me at his hip. Even when he sat to eat, I rested within reach. His hand sometimes hovered near me when he wasn't even aware of it. That's how it starts, you know. Blades become part of your posture. I could feel it in the way he walked, how his stride had grown heavier, how his back no longer curved in rest. He stood like someone always expecting to be struck. It wasn't paranoia. The world gave him reasons. Bandits still roamed the forests. Neighboring towns were overrun by mercenaries. Travelers spoke of kings rising and falling like the sun, of taxes turning to threats, of peace being a word only spoken in prayers. The village changed too. They started locking their doors, started digging shallow ditches and calling them defenses, started looking to him for decisions. He was still young, but younger men had died. He had survived. And survival, in times like those, was the closest thing anyone had to wisdom. That frightened me more than anything, because he listened. They told him he was meant for more than farming. They told him he had a gift, that courage ran in his blood, that he had a warrior's instinct. They said it like it was a blessing, but I knew better. One day, a merchant came limping into the village. His cart had been ransacked. His apprentice was missing. He spoke of a gang holed up in the northern woods, 4 men with armor stitched from stolen cloth, one of them wielding a spear tipped in gold. The boy, now barely still a boy, gathered a group of villagers and volunteered to go. "You've handled worse," they told him. "You have the blade," they said. "With that dagger, you're invincible." How wrong they were. I've never made anyone invincible. That forest was colder than the mountains, dark, wet, smelling of rot and ash. Every step squished, every branch snapped like bone. They moved slowly, 4 men and 1 boy, with me at his side, twitching at every shift of wind. They found the camp's coast just past dusk. Tents made of wool and regret, smoke curling from an unguarded fire, and laughter, low, lazy, like they thought the world had forgotten them. The boy didn't wait. He crept into the camp like a shadow and moved faster than breath. He slit the first man's throat before the others even looked up. And we were already in motion. The second man lunged. The boy ducked. I sank deep into the soft spot beneath his ribs. Hot blood spilled, thick and fast. It soaked his sleeve. He didn't flinch. The others tried to run. He didn't let them. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was quiet, precise, like he was checking off a list. And that was the part that terrified me. Because this wasn't self-defense. This wasn't survival. This was control. He tied up the survivor, the one with the gold-tipped spear, brought him back to the village, said he would face justice. But that night, when the others were asleep, the boy took me and walked behind the barn. The prisoner never screamed. When he returned, he said nothing, washed me clean in the stream, dried me with a cloth, then sat by the fire and stared into the coals as if they might tell him who he was becoming. I wanted to tell him, "You're walking the same path. You're not lost yet, but you're close." But I couldn't. I was only a dagger, just metal and memory. And he was still a boy, carrying the weight of men. The villagers praised him the next day, called him the forest's sword, a protector, a guardian. No one asked what he had to do to earn that title. No one asked how much of his sleep he was now sacrificing just to feel worthy of it. They didn't see the blood on his soul, only the shine of his blade, only me. If I could speak, I would have told him blood is not the hardest thing to clean. Guilt is. He kept trying, though. After every fight, he scrubbed me. He used water when there was plenty, or rags when it was scarce. Sometimes he'd use sand, rubbing me raw with rough hands until his knuckles cracked. He polished until I gleamed, then tucked me away beneath his bedroll like I was innocent again. But I wasn't, and neither was he. What he couldn't scrub clean were the memories, the faces, the way people started to look at him with a blend of admiration and unease. He had become a symbol now, someone to be called upon when danger came knocking, and danger always came. A tax collector too cruel, a neighboring farmer who took too much land, a traveler with a wicked gleam in his eye. Each time they turned to him, and each time he turned to me. I didn't speak, but I could feel the questions in his grip. Am I doing the right thing? Is this who I'm meant to be? How many more before I can finally rest? And I had no answers. We crossed paths with a priest once, an old man whose robes were stitched from 100 different patches. He walked the roads barefoot, carrying a small bell that rang with every step. He sat beside our fire and spoke little, just watched the boy clean me with quiet, steady motions. "You carry something cursed," the priest said at last. The boy paused. "You mean the dagger?" The priest shook his head. "I mean the silence it brings, the weight you don't speak of." For a moment I thought the boy might cry, but he didn't. He just nodded and kept polishing. The priest left before sunrise. That day, the boy didn't wear me. He left me wrapped in cloth, hidden in the hollow of a tree. I could feel the wind brushing against the bark, and far in the distance I could hear his voice, arguing with a farmer, then laughing with a child, then quiet again. It was the longest he'd been without me in months, and for a moment I hoped he was finding his way back. But night came, and so did the sound of heavy boots, and raised voices, and the sharp crack of wood breaking. He returned in a rush, unwrapped me with shaking hands, and said nothing, just held me against his chest as the village burned behind him. They had come for the priest, said he was a spy, said he cursed the land. They blamed the boy for letting him pass, said he had grown soft, said he was forgetting who he was supposed to be. So he reminded them with me, and when it was over, he didn't even bother to wash me, just sat alone in the ashes, his eyes glowing orange with the reflection of everything he'd lost. That night, I heard him whisper something to himself. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't even a curse. It was just one word, over and over. Enough. But enough never comes. Not when you've tasted violence. Not when it becomes the only language the world listens to. The next town we reached was already in mourning. A merchant caravan had been slaughtered, children and all. The people begged for help, asked if the boy was the dagger bearer, said they'd heard stories, that he was a ghost, that he left no survivors. He shook his head, said he was done. But then they showed him a ribbon, red and gold, frayed at the edge. He stared at it for a long time, and then he took me back out of the bag. We followed the trail through the valley, across the river, up the northern cliffs where the winds howled like wolves. The men we found weren't bandits, really. They were soldiers gone rogue, tired of kings, tired of orders, tired of fighting someone else's war and coming home to empty villages and forgotten names. Their leader was young, younger than the boy, and when the two of them faced each other, steel to steel, I felt something strange. They weren't enemies, they were mirrors. Both of them tired, both of them angry, both of them made of wounds, pretending to be flesh. And still they fought. The boy moved fast, but the other was faster. He dodged, twisted, parried. I barely grazed his side. The fight stretched long, slow, brutal, until finally the boy tackled him to the ground. He raised me high and froze, because the young soldier said nothing, didn't beg, didn't scream. He just looked up and said, "Is it worth it?" That was all. And something in the boy broke. He dropped me, just let me fall into the dirt, and walked away. The other boy didn't follow. He just lay there, bleeding but alive, staring at the clouds like he'd never seen them before. That night, the boy didn't speak. He sat by the fire, back turned to me, hands still stained. I could feel the tremor in his shoulders, not from fear, from exhaustion, from carrying too many ghosts. He didn't touch me for 3 days. When he finally did, it wasn't to fight. He took me to a mountain lake, silent, blue, deep, and stood ankle deep in the cold water. He held me in both hands, looked at my reflection, and whispered, "You're not the curse. I am." Then he threw me high into the air, spinning, falling, sinking, and the water took me. If I could speak, I would tell you about the moment I first heard her cry. No, not the woman he was sent to kill, but the child who hid behind her. The assassin hadn't known she would be there. She was not mentioned in the parchment sealed with wax and ambition. No name, no description, just the mother. But as the man raised me, his trusted blade, I felt his fingers hesitate, just slightly. And then she cried, not in terror, not in fear, but in sorrow, the pure kind that cuts deeper than any dagger ever could. It was the sound of innocence bearing witness. I remember the weight of guilt, though it was not mine to bear. I remember the blood cooling too quickly on a floor too cold. I remember being shoved back into the sheath like a sin that must be hidden but never washed away. The assassin left in silence, no coin, no smile, no thrill of conquest, just silence. We wandered for days after that. He stopped speaking. He no longer sharpened me. He drank more. He cut less. I dulled, not from age, but from abandonment. The rust that crept along my edge was not just iron's decay, but a sickness of the soul that touched us both. We became exiles together. I, a relic of regret. He, a ghost in human skin. In one village, he gave me away, not sold, just gave, to a blacksmith who admired my design. "May it do better in your hands," he whispered. And so I sat for years on a dusty wall, unused, unwanted, a decoration with a deadly past. But blades are never just for show. One day, a boy came into the forge, barely 12, eyes full of fire, hands trembling with hunger, not for food, but for revenge. He asked to buy a blade, any blade, one he could afford. The blacksmith looked at me. He said, "Take that one, no charge, it's seen enough blood." The boy nodded, unaware that he was gripping a past soaked in sorrow. He ran off with me, too light in his grasp, too small for his mission, too eager to make scars of his own. That night I tasted blood again, but this time it wasn't the boy's enemy. It was the boy himself, an ambush, a misstep, a lesson in the cruelty of vengeance. He fell in the mud, clutching me, as if I could save him. If I could speak, I would have told him, "Put me down, live instead." But silence is the curse of blades. I was found beside his body by a farmer, then passed to a merchant, then traded to a soldier. I changed hands more times than I can remember, until memory itself became a blur of skin, sweat, steel, and sorrow. By now I had no allegiance, no wielder stayed long. Each had their cause, each had their reasons, none had peace. And still I cut, still I killed, but with each new hand my soul grew heavier, though I had no soul of my own. One evening, during a lull in battle, I was left on a stone. A woman, tired, bloodied, a soldier herself, picked me up. She didn't wield me. She just stared, long and quiet. "You're tired," she said, as if speaking to a thing that could understand. So am I. She wrapped me in cloth, placed me in her bag, walked away. She never used me, not once, but she kept me close. For the first time I felt carried not as a weapon, but as a memory. That woman, she changed everything. And in her silence, I began to believe that maybe not all stories have to end in blood.
If I could speak, I would whisper now, not shout. This is not a tale for drums or trumpets. It is a slow breath, the final exhale of a long life spent in the shadows. And I am ready. The woman who carried me was unlike anyone I had known. She wore no crest. She fought in no name. Her armor was mismatched, her hands scarred but soft. When she found me, I had already given up on being anything but a curse passed from one soul to the next. But she didn't draw me. Not even once. She never asked me to taste blood again. I lay wrapped in cloth, tucked near her side like an old letter one cannot bring themselves to burn. She slept beside me. We moved together through towns and forests, over mountains, across rivers, always walking, always quiet. She spoke to me sometimes, not like the others, not like I was a tool. She spoke like I was a witness. "Do you remember the city of brass?" she once asked under a silver moon. "I saw it burn when I was a girl. That night I swore I'd never draw steel unless it was to shield someone." She looked at me. "Have you ever been used to protect, little Dagger?" If I could speak, I would have said, "Not yet." But she was patient. She never asked for answers, only offered her thoughts as gifts no one else had time for. The others who held me were loud, fast, and filled with want. She was tired of wanting. She simply walked. And I began to understand what it meant to rest. We found a quiet village eventually. It wasn't much. A stream, a bakery, a temple that leaned a little too far east. People who smiled and didn't ask too many questions. She lived in a small cottage just outside the edge of it, where the woods began. No one knew who she had been. No one cared. She became the healer, the quiet one with the old eyes and a limp. I stayed with her, always wrapped in that same cloth. She kept me in a wooden box at the foot of her bed. Sometimes she would take me out just to oil me, speak to me as though I were a friend who had weathered wars but earned the right to be still. Years passed. Her hair went silver, her hands slower, her voice softer. Children came to her for stories. She never told them about the war. She never told them about pain. She told them about stars and birds and rivers that ran backward when the moon was full. She told them about forgiveness. One child, curious and bright-eyed, once asked her what was in the box at the end of her bed. "A story," she said with a smile. "One I'm not ready to tell." She never opened it for them. And I didn't mind. I came to feel like a relic of who she used to be. Not a danger, not a regret, just a reminder. A mirror she chose not to shatter. And then, one winter, her breath grew shallow. Her fire went out too early one night. The village folk found her still, peaceful, as if sleeping. No pain, no struggle. Just stillness. They buried her near the woods. But before they did, one of the elders, who had known more than he ever said, opened the box. He found me. He lifted me carefully, ran his thumb across my edge. Still sharp, despite the years. "She carried you all that time," he whispered, "and never used you." He looked out toward the woods. Maybe that's how she won. He didn't place me in the dirt with her. No. He carried me to the temple, wrapped in fresh cloth, and set me on a shelf of relics. Not for worship, not for display, just for silence. And now I sit, in a room filled with echoes. Sunlight filters in through the high windows. Dust dances above me in the warm air. No hands reach for me. No wars call me. I am no longer a dagger in a fist. I am a memory on a shelf. A caution, a witness. A final sigh in a long chain of violence. If I could speak, I would tell you this. It did suck to be the dagger of a medieval assassin. But it was beautiful to be the blade that was never drawn again. And if there is a kind of peace for something like me, I think I have found it here. In stillness, in quiet, in being forgotten gently.